Hello, everybody. So, one thing I want to talk to you about now is the plant life cycle. Um, Hold on a minute. Is my microphone on? Okay, I guess it is. All right. So, all land plants have something called the alternation of generations life cycle, which means they have two different entities, like two different beings in their life cycle. Okay. One of them is haploid and one of them is diploid. The diploid organism is called the sporophyte and the haploid organism is called the gametophyte. So sporophytes make spores. Phyte means plant in Latin or Greek, okay? So sporophyte means spore plant. The name of that organism tells you what it makes. So sporophytes are spore-making plants. They make spores. Now a spore is simply a cell protected by sporopollenin. It's a haploid cell made by meiosis that falls on the ground and divides and grows into an organism called the gametophyte. So those two organisms, right? Uh, Sporophytes are diploid. They make a spore by meiosis. It grows into a gametophyte, another organism. That gametophyte is haploid. It only has one set of chromosomes. It makes gametes, sperm and egg, or sperm or egg, depending on the plant. But it does it through mitosis, unlike animals, because it's already haploid. The gametophyte is a plant that is haploid, and it's making sperm or egg, so it's doing that by mitosis. They fuse together, that sperm and egg, via fertilization, leading to another sporophyte. So a zygote, which develops into a sporophyte. So sperm and egg fuse, that makes an embryo. Embryos divide, that makes a zygote. That grows into a sporophyte. So sporophyte is diploid, makes spores, which are haploid. So one way to kind of get this into your head is to remember that the sporophyte is the only part of the whole life cycle that's diploid. So knowing that it's diploid and knowing that its name is sporophyte, you know it makes spores, so you know it has to be meiosis next. So meiosis makes spores. Spores grow and the difference between a spore and a gamete, let me just mention this, is that spores just grow into something. They don't fuse together like gametes do. There's no fertilization involved. So spores are made by sporophytes. They are haploid. They grow into a gametophyte, which is another plant that's also haploid, and it makes gametes by mitosis, which fuse together then to lead to the sporophyte generation yet again. Here's another diagram showing the same thing. So let's start with sporophyte. Sporophytes are a diploid plant. They have a structure called a sporangia, or a sporangia that makes spores. But in the sporangia, meiosis takes place, making spores. Spores grow into gametophytes. Gametophytes make gametes by mitosis, which grow, excuse me, into the sporophyte. So this is different than humans or most animals. This is called the alternation of generations because there's two different generations, as it were, two different organisms in a plant life cycle. So spores are made in a structure called a sporangium, um, and we'll see those hopefully in lab in a few weeks inside of a moss. The little capsules that grow up on a moss are sporangia. You also often see sporangia on the bottom of fern leaves, things like that. So the first group of land plants that we're going to talk about, we're going to call the bryophytes or the non-vascular plants seen here. This clade here, it's actually three distinct groups, um, and we're lumping them together. Technically, I guess they're not exactly a clade, but I tend to focus only on the mosses as the example of the bryophytes. So liverworts, mosses, and hornworts, collectively, we can call them the bryophytes. Bryophytes have quite a bit of diversity. As you can see there, the mosses, the phylum Bryophyta, has 15,000 known species. There are only 12,000 known species of ferns, but there are almost a 250,000 known flowering plants. But mosses are pretty diverse. So we're going to talk about the bryophytes as a collective group using mosses as our example organism. So first things first, bryophytes have a alternation of generation life cycle just like all plants. Um, and I already went over this, but I have it here in text form. So plants have two different generations. One is haploid, and it grows from a spore. If it grows from a spore, it's a gametophyte. Gametophyte, phyte means plant. Gametophyte is a plant that makes gametes. Sporophytes is it grows from a fertilized egg, basically. It is a plant that makes spores or sporophyte. Okay. Now, bryophytes, the mosses and other moss-like plants, are unique in the plant world because the big green thing that you see is the gametophyte. It's haploid, it makes gametes. So the big green fluffy stuff that you see is gametophyte. And these are not terribly well adapted to land. They're okay on land. They live on land, of course. They live all around the Lewis Science Center, and they live on the sides of trees, and they live next to the Conway Center for Sciences, Conway Corporate Center for Sciences, and you can find them outside. But they don't have vascular tissue. They rely on simple diffusion to get water from one part of the plant to another. And another thing is they don't have leaves. They have just a what we call a body, and that body might be kind of green and leaf-like, but they don't have different organs. They don't have roots. They just have little one-cell hairs that help hold the plant to the ground, but they don't absorb water. So this group lacks vascular tissue. They don't have xylem or phloem. They also are tied to water in that they require water to get sperm to the egg. When it rains, the sperm are released, and the sperm can swim to the egg to uh, to fertilize it. So they're kind of tied to the water, kind of like their algae ancestors. I think of these as the amphibians of the plant world. They need to. They're small because they can't get big because they don't have tissues to move water around, and they still require water for sex. Now, when sperm meets egg, it makes a zygote that grows into a sporophyte. The sporophytes are just real small. They look kind of like this. They make spores and then they dry up and die, which is why we say it's a gametophyte dominant life cycle. The gametophyte lives a long time, but the sporophyte is always connected to the gametophyte. It doesn't get its own, it doesn't really photosynthesize when it's mature. It gets all of its nutrients from the gametophyte. It makes its spores, it dies. That's a very short-lived plant. So here is the life cycle of this group in a nutshell. Um, we have the sporophyte here. It is that little thing growing out of the gametophyte. It makes spores by meiosis. They grow into more moss plants, the gametophyte stage. That makes gametes. Sperms swim to the egg, fertilize it to make another sporophyte. That's the life cycle. The life cycle I'm going to focus on, though, for the exam, this is a good one to understand, but the one I'm going to focus on the exam is going to be sort of the generic plant life cycle or the fern life cycle. So the generic one meaning the one I had a few slides back, but I'm going to say go ahead and study the fern life cycle more than the moss life cycle. It's the same basic life cycle, but the fern is sporophyte dominant, meaning the big thing that lives a long time is the sporophyte, whereas the gametophyte is really small and doesn't and not very noticeable in the fern. All right, so just to remind us then, what is going on here? The sporophyte generation produces spores by meiosis. It's a diploid plant. It makes spores by meiosis, and those spores grow into gametophytes. They blow around in the wind, land on the ground, grow into gametophytes. The gametophyte generation is haploid, and it makes gametes. And since it's already haploid, it can't do meiosis, so it does mitosis, right? So that's very different than an animal life cycle, in which case you just have a diploid organism that makes gametes by meiosis that fuse together to grow into another diploid organism. Spores are made in a structure. A part of the sporophyte is called the sporangia or sporangium. That's just a structure, the actual structure that makes the spores. It's part of the sporophyte. And then the gametophyte grows from a spore, which is just a cell covered in sporopollen. And think of sporopollen like a spacesuit. If it was just a cell on its own, it would dry out and die, but it's covered in this protective layer. And this spore grows into a gametophyte. Here's a fern gametophyte, which would be about the size of your pinky nail. Over here is a moss gametophyte growing. Those two organisms both grew from a spore, and they will both make gametes, sperm or egg, that will lead to the next sporophyte generation. By the way, flowering plants and conifers also make spores, but spores grow into pollen grains, male male gametophytes in seed plants, and spores are found inside of the seeds of seed plants, and they just grow into gametophytes that you never see that then make an egg. So that way there can be an embryo that develops inside of that seed. All right, so I believe that does it for this quick lecture on gametophytes and sporophytes and the bryophyte group. Remember, they are vascular free. They don't have vascular tissue. They can't get very big, and they're gametophyte dominant, meaning the gametophyte lives a long time. The next thing we'll look at then is the evolution of the vascular plants, including the ferns, and then we'll move on to the seed plants after that.